Picture this. It's 4:30 in the morning, February 1892, Montreal. You open your eyes, if you can call it that, in a room so cold your breath looks like factory smoke. There's no central heating here, no thermostat on the wall. Just you, a thin blanket that 3 people are sharing, and frost creeping across the inside of your window like nature's reminder that you're not really safe, even indoors. So here's my question for you. How do you start your day when the thing trying to kill you isn't some distant threat, but the temperature of your own bedroom? Let me walk you through what morning actually meant for a working-class Montrealer in the 1890s. We're talking about families crammed into tenement apartments in neighborhoods like Griffintown or Saint-Henri. These aren't cozy little homes. These are industrial-era survival pods, built fast and cheap to house the labor force flooding into the city. A typical apartment, maybe 2 rooms for a family of 6, 7, sometimes more. Walls so thin you hear your neighbors coughing through the night, and in winter, those walls might as well be made of paper. The first person awake is usually the mother, always the mother. She's up before dawn, not because she wants to be, but because survival runs on a tight schedule. Her first task, get the stove going. That means coal, if there's any left. If yesterday's wages were decent, maybe there's a small pile in the corner. If not, she's burning whatever scraps of wood the kids scavenged from construction sites or alleyways the day before. Now, coal in the 1890s wasn't some luxury item you debated over. It was currency. It was survival. A bag of coal could cost a quarter of a day's wages for a factory laborer. And when you're making maybe $1, $1.50 a day if you're lucky, that quarter matters. A lot. So families rationed. They burned just enough to take the edge off the cold, just enough to boil water for watery oatmeal or yesterday's bread softened in milk, if there was milk. Children wake up next, not because they're rested. Most of them sleep 2, 3 to a bed, curled together for warmth. They wake because their mother is making noise, because their father is already pulling on his boots, or because they've learned that in houses like this, you don't get to sleep in. There's no childhood buffer here. No lazy Sunday mornings. If you're old enough to walk, you're old enough to contribute. Here's something that hits different when you think about it. Frost on the inside of windows. That's not poetic. That's physics. It means the temperature inside your home is hovering right around freezing. Families would hang blankets over doorways to trap any heat in one room, essentially abandoning the rest of the apartment to the cold. You got dressed under your blanket. You didn't wash, not really. Water was cold, soap was expensive, and privacy was a fantasy. And let's talk about those wages I mentioned. A dock worker might make $1.20 a day. A seamstress working from home, maybe 50 cents for 12 hours of stitching. A factory laborer in the textile mills that dominated the Montreal economy, somewhere in between, but never enough. Because here's the thing about 1890s wages. They were designed to keep you alive, not comfortable. You earned just enough to come back tomorrow. That's it. That's the math. So by the time the sun even thinks about rising, if you can see it through the industrial smog, a working-class Montreal family has already made a dozen survival calculations. Do we burn more coal or wear more layers? Do the kids eat first? Or does the father, since he needs strength for 10 hours at the factory? Do we fix the broken window or hope the cold doesn't kill anyone this week? And all of this, every single bit of it, happens before the city even wakes up. You step outside, and immediately you smell it. No, seriously, stop for a second and imagine what I'm describing here. Because the streets of 1890s Montreal didn't just look different from today. They smelled different. Fundamentally, viscerally different. This wasn't the occasional whiff of garbage on a hot day. This was a permanent, inescapable wall of odor that hit you the moment you opened your door. Horse manure everywhere. Think about this. Montreal in the 1890s had roughly 250,000 people. And supporting that population, Thousands of horses, delivery horses, streetcar horses, private carriage horses, working draft horses pulling industrial loads. Every single one of them producing, conservatively, about 20 pounds of manure per day. Do the math. We're talking tons, literal tons of horse waste accumulating daily on streets that had minimal sanitation infrastructure. It piled up on corners. It mixed with rain and snow to create this thick, toxic sludge that coated the cobblestones. In summer, it dried and turned to dust that you breathed. In winter, it froze into treacherous, contaminated ice. And the smell? Imagine ammonia mixed with decay, baked by sun, or frozen into the air you had no choice but to breathe. But wait, it gets worse. Because horse manure was just one ingredient in this aromatic nightmare. Factory smoke poured from chimneys across the industrial districts. The textile mills, the foundries, the locomotive works, all of them burning coal, belching black smoke that settled over neighborhoods like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't the occasional industrial zone you could avoid. In working-class areas like Pointe Saint-Charles or Griffintown, you lived inside the smoke. Your laundry dried gray, your windows stayed coated in soot. Children developed respiratory problems before they turned 10, and nobody used the word pollution because pollution was just normal. And then there was the sewage. Oh, the sewage. Here's a fun fact for you. In 1890s Montreal, proper sewage systems existed in wealthy neighborhoods. Notice I said proper sewage systems, not all neighborhoods. Down where working families lived, raw sewage often drained into open gutters, into the street, sometimes directly into the same waterways people drew drinking water from. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery. These weren't distant medical terms. They were seasonal facts of life. Now, layer in rotting food waste. There was no weekly garbage collection, no sanitation trucks rolling through at dawn. Spoiled vegetables, fish heads, animal carcasses from butcher shops. It all went into the street or into communal waste areas that overflowed constantly. Rats weren't pests, they were neighbors. And the diseases they carried? Those were just part of the background radiation of urban poverty. So here's my question. How do you build a life when your environment is actively trying to make you sick? Let me paint you a morning scene. It's 6 a.m. The streets are already packed. Factory whistles have been blowing since 5:30, and workers are flooding toward the mills. Men in worn jackets, caps pulled low, lunch pails in hand, if they're lucky enough to have lunch. Women clutching shawls, heading to garment workshops or domestic service jobs in the wealthier parts of town. And children. So many children. Because here's something crucial to understand. In the 1890s, the streets belonged to labor. Before sunrise, you'd see boys as young as 7 or 8 selling newspapers on corners, shouting headlines in French and English to catch the attention of hurried commuters. Girls helping their mothers carry laundry to well-off homes uphill, their small hands already red and rough from lye soap and cold water. Street vendors crowded every corner, bread sellers, milk carts, knife sharpeners, rag collectors. Everyone hustling, everyone desperate for a few cents, everyone operating in this chaotic, informal economy that kept the city functioning but kept individuals trapped in perpetual survival mode. And woven through all of this, beggars, veterans with missing limbs from conflicts nobody remembered, widows with hungry children clinging to their skirts, the elderly, the sick, the mentally ill, all of them invisible to the wealthy, unavoidable to everyone else. Because in 1890s Montreal, there was no safety net, no welfare system, no social security. You worked, you begged, you stole, or you died. Those were the options. The noise alone was overwhelming. Horse hooves on cobblestones, factory whistles, screaming shift changes, street vendors shouting prices, children crying, arguments erupting in doorways. Church bells marking time that nobody had. It was relentless, grinding, exhausting before the day truly even started. And here's the thing that really gets me. This was normal. This was just Tuesday. People didn't walk through these streets thinking, "This is awful." They walked through thinking, I need to get to work before I lose my job. Survival doesn't leave room for commentary. So by the time the sun fully rose over Montreal, filtered through factory smoke and winter haze, thousands of people had already navigated streets designed more for commerce than human dignity, breathing air that was slowly poisoning them, walking past suffering they couldn't afford to acknowledge. You made it to work. Congratulations. Now the real punishment begins. Let me ask you something. What do you think a factory shift felt like in 1890s Montreal? And I don't mean in some abstract, historical textbook way. I mean physically, in your body, in your lungs, in your hands after hour 7 of a 10-hour day doing the same motion over and over and over. Let's start with the textile mills, because Montreal in the 1890s was a textile powerhouse. These massive brick buildings dominated neighborhoods, employing thousands, mostly women and children. You'd think that sounds progressive, right? Women in the workforce? Here's the reality. They were hired because they could be paid less. A man might make $1.20 a day. A woman? 60, 70 cents for the exact same hours. A child? Even less. Picture walking into one of these mills at 6 in the morning. The noise hits you first, a deafening roar of machinery that makes conversation impossible. Looms clattering, gears grinding, steam engines powering hundreds of mechanical parts simultaneously. Workers communicated through hand signals and lip reading because shouting was useless. And this noise? It didn't stop. Not for 10 hours, not for 12 if they needed overtime. Your ears rang when you finally left, and many workers developed permanent hearing damage before they turned 30. The air inside was deliberately kept humid because damp air kept the cotton threads from breaking. Sounds practical, right? Except that humidity combined with cotton dust created this thick, suffocating atmosphere that coated your lungs. Women coughed constantly. Mill lung or cotton lung, early names for what we'd now call byssinosis or industrial respiratory disease. You breathed in fiber particles all day, every day, until your lungs just gave up. And the machines? They didn't have safety guards. They didn't have emergency shutoffs. They had exposed gears, spinning flywheels, and fast-moving parts that could catch loose clothing, long hair, or an exhausted worker's hand in a fraction of a second. Injuries were horrifically common. Lost fingers, mangled hands, scalping accidents where hair got caught in machinery. These weren't rare horror stories. They were monthly occurrences. Here's what really gets me. There was no workers' compensation, no disability pay, no company responsibility. If you got injured, you got fired. Because an injured worker couldn't produce, and production was the only thing that mattered. So you'd see people working through injuries, hiding broken fingers, pushing through pain because stopping meant losing everything. Let me tell you about the foundries and metalworks, because those were somehow even worse. Imagine working next to a blast furnace in summer. Temperatures inside these factories regularly hit 100, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Men stripped to undershirts, pouring molten metal, breathing air thick with metallic dust and coal smoke. Heat exhaustion was expected. Burns were routine. And ventilation? What ventilation? The railway shops, the machinery plants, the dock work, all of it operated on the same brutal logic. Maximum output, minimum cost, and human bodies were the cheapest resource. A dock worker loading cargo might haul 100-pound sacks for 10 hours straight. A machinist might stand in the same spot, operating the same press, making the same part thousands of times a day, until his back gave out, or his hands developed arthritis by age 40. And shifts didn't follow our modern concept of time. There was no 8-hour workday. That was a union demand, a radical idea that wouldn't gain traction for decades. In the 1890s, 10 hours was standard, 12 wasn't unusual, 14 happened. And during busy seasons, factories ran around the clock with rotating shifts that destroyed any semblance of normal sleep patterns. So here's my question. What happens to a human body when it's treated like industrial equipment? The answer is simple. It breaks, and it breaks young. Men in their 50s looked 70, backs bent from years of heavy lifting, hands gnarled from repetitive strain, lungs damaged from breathing poisoned air. And the thing is, there was no retirement, no pension. You worked until you physically couldn't anymore, and then you depended on family, if you had family, or you ended up on the street. Women faced additional layers of brutality. Pregnant women worked until they literally went into labor, sometimes giving birth in factory bathrooms, before returning to their stations days later, because they couldn't afford to lose the job. Sexual harassment from foremen was rampant and unaddressed. Complain, and you'd be replaced by the end of the day. And children? Let's be clear about what child labor actually meant. We're not talking about teenagers learning trades. We're talking about 8-year-olds operating dangerous machinery, working in conditions that would be illegal for adults today. Their small hands made them useful for reaching into tight spaces in machines that didn't stop when those small hands got caught. Rest breaks were minimal. Lunch was eaten standing up or at your station. Bathrooms were scarce and filthy. Drinking water, if available, came from dubious sources. And if you slowed down, if you showed weakness, if you complained, there were 10 people outside ready to take your place. Because that's the thing about industrial capitalism in the 1890s. Labor was abundant and cheap. You weren't valuable. You were replaceable. And that knowledge hung over every worker every single day, like the smoke pouring from the factory chimneys above them. The factory whistle blows, your shift is over. But here's the question nobody asks in history books. What happens after work when work has already taken everything you have? Let me walk you through what evening actually looked like for a working-class Montrealer in the 1890s. Because this is where survival stops being about labor and starts being about choices, hard choices, that reveal just how thin the line was between getting by and falling through. You drag yourself home. 10 hours in the mill, the foundry, the docks, your body is screaming. Your hands are stiff. Your lungs hurt from breathing cotton dust or coal smoke all day. Maybe you grabbed a piece of bread at lunch. Maybe you didn't. Either way, you're hungry in a way that goes beyond appetite. This is the hunger of a body that's burned more calories than it's consumed day after day, week after week. And here's where it gets real. You walk into your tenement and dinner isn't guaranteed. Your wife, who's been working too, by the way, doing laundry for wealthy families or sewing piecework at home, has maybe scraped together enough for soup, potato soup if you're lucky, bread soaked in lard, cheap cuts of meat so questionable you don't ask where they came from. This isn't food as fuel. This isn't nutrition. This is just something to fill the emptiness until tomorrow. Children are still awake, not because they want to be, but because they're hungry too, or because the baby won't stop crying, or because there's simply nowhere else to be in a 2-room apartment shared by 7 people. Privacy doesn't exist here. Rest is negotiated, not guaranteed. And the stress, the constant grinding stress of never having enough, it seeps into everything. Marriages, parent-child relationships, mental health. So what do people do when the weight becomes unbearable? They go to the tavern. Now, before you judge, understand what taverns represented in 1890s Montreal. These weren't just places to drink. They were community centers, employment networks, brief escapes from conditions that were genuinely unlivable. A glass of beer cost a few cents, cheaper than a decent meal, and for an hour or two, the pain in your back dulled. The fear about tomorrow's rent faded. The humiliation of your circumstances became bearable. But alcohol, of course, came with its own costs. Wages that should have gone to food went to drink. Domestic violence spiked. Alcoholism wasn't a personal failing in these neighborhoods. It was an epidemic, a rational response to irrational conditions. And the cycle was vicious. Drink to forget. Wake up poorer. Work harder. Drink to forget again. And then there were the other gray zones, the informal economies that operated after dark, in the shadows between legality and survival. Stolen goods changed hands in alleyways. Women, desperate, widowed, or simply unable to survive on legitimate wages, turned to prostitution, not as a choice, but as arithmetic. Your children are hungry. Rent is due. Your body is the only asset you have left. Gambling dens operated in basements. Cards, dice, bare-knuckle fights, anything that offered the illusion of a way out. The fantasy that tonight might be the night you win enough to change everything. Spoiler, it never was. But hope, even false hope, was a commodity in neighborhoods where real hope had been systematically extracted. Here's something that haunts me. Crime in these neighborhoods wasn't driven by evil, it was driven by math. A dock worker stealing coal to heat his family's apartment wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a father doing calculus, risk of getting caught versus certainty of his children freezing. A woman shoplifting food wasn't immoral. She was a mother choosing between legal starvation and illegal survival. And the police? They knew, everyone knew, but enforcement was selective, often brutal, and always shaped by class. Steal from a wealthy merchant, that's a crime. Steal from your equally poor neighbor? That might get ignored. The justice system wasn't about fairness. It was about protecting property and maintaining order in a fundamentally disordered system. As night deepened, the streets transformed. Streetlights, gas-powered, inconsistent, casting long shadows, created pockets of visibility in darkness. Legitimate workers headed home, the night shift headed to factories. And in between, Montreal's underclass navigated a world where survival often demanded exactly the kind of moral compromises that respectable society condemned, but created through its own economic brutality. Women walked home clutching what little money they'd earned, hyper-aware that getting robbed meant their family didn't eat tomorrow. Men debated whether to spend their last coins on food or fuel, knowing either choice meant suffering. Children, exhausted from their own labor, fell asleep to the sounds of parents arguing about bills, about sickness, about futures that seemed to only ever get darker. And winter. Let's talk about winter one more time. Because when snow buried Montreal, everything got exponentially worse. Food prices spiked, fuel became more expensive, work slowed in outdoor industries, meaning less income exactly when expenses increased. People froze to death in their apartments. Not in some dramatic way, just quietly. An elderly person, a sick child, someone too weak to generate enough body heat to survive another night. Death certificates from this era are heartbreaking. Exposure, malnutrition, but complications from pneumonia, which really meant too poor to afford a doctor or proper heating. These weren't tragedies in the classical sense. They were predictable outcomes of a system that valued profit over people. So when you ask what daily survival looked like in 1890s Montreal, here's your answer. It looked like making impossible choices. It looked like sacrificing your body to keep your family fed. It looked like watching your children grow up too fast, knowing they'd inherit the same brutal cycle you couldn't escape. It looked like waking up every single morning and doing it all over again. Because giving up meant dying, and as long as you were breathing, you fought. That was survival. Raw, unglamorous, and real.